The man who delivered the news was not a stranger, but he was not family. He was a solicitor, a man whose face was a collection of soft, apologetic lines that failed to conceal the hard bones of his purpose. He stood in the entryway of the only home Alara had ever known, his hat held in both hands over his waistcoat, a gesture of synthetic sympathy. Her uncle, Silas, stood behind him, a shadow in the dim hall, his presence a block of cold, indifferent granite. "The estate is settled, Alara," the solicitor said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "As you know, your mother's will stipulated the house be sold, the proceeds to be managed by your uncle until his passing." Alara said nothing. She did not look at her uncle. She looked at a spot on the wall where a hairline crack spiderwebbed out from the corner of the doorframe, a flaw her grandfather would have tutted at, would have repaired with a patient sigh and a dab of perfectly mixed plaster. He had taught her how to see such things. He had taught her how to see the bones of a house, the flow of its stresses, the secrets of its joinery. He had taught her everything, except how to withstand this quiet, administrative demolition of her life. "There is the matter of your own effects," the solicitor continued, clearing his throat. "And this." He held out a thin white envelope. "Your uncle has seen fit to provide you with a final settlement, a gesture of goodwill to help you start anew." Her hand did not move to take it. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. It was her uncle who finally broke it, stepping forward and pressing the envelope into her hand. His fingers were cold and brief against hers. "It is $300, he said, his voice flat, devoid of malice or kindness. It was the voice one used to state the price of feed or the time of a train's departure. "The new owners will arrive in 2 days. You should be gone by then." She did not cry. She did not plead. The grief was a solid, cold stone in her chest, too heavy to be moved by tears. The skills her grandfather had given her were not for this. They were for shaping wood and stone, for finding true north and a level line, not for negotiating the treacherous terrain of a human heart turned to barren ground. He had been a stonemason and a shipwright's carpenter, a man who believed the world could be understood and set right with the proper application of knowledge and a steady hand. He had left her a fortress of love and competence, but its walls were now being dismantled from the inside. She nodded once, a short, sharp dip of her head. The solicitor seemed relieved. Her uncle merely turned and walked back into the shadows of the house that was no longer hers. That night, she packed. It did not take long. Her life fit into a single canvas satchel. She took 2 changes of clothes, a small tin of biscuits, and her grandfather's tools. They were not many, but they were the best of their kind, their steel holding an edge like a memory, their wooden handles worn smooth and dark by his grip. A dovetail saw, a set of chisels in a leather roll, a small, sharp adze, and a folding rule of ivory and German silver. Lastly, she took the heart of his craft, the object he had placed in her hand the day she turned 16. It was a plumb bob, turned from a solid piece of brass, heavy and dense in her palm. Its point was still perfect, its surface a warm, unpolished gold. "This tells the truth," he had told her, his voice a low rumble. "The earth doesn't lie, Alara. Gravity doesn't lie. This little weight will always show you the way down, the true vertical. Trust it more than you trust princes or politicians." She wrapped it in a soft cloth and placed it in the deepest part of her satchel. She took the envelope with the $300 and tucked it away, an insult she would be forced to use as a shield. She lay on her bed for the last time, the smells of beeswax and old paper and the faint clean scent of pine from her grandfather's workshop, clinging to the air like ghosts. She did not sleep. She waited for the first hint of gray in the eastern sky. At dawn, she walked out the back door, through the garden her grandmother had tended, past the workshop where the scent of sawdust still lingered. She did not look back. She walked down the long dirt lane, the canvas satchel slung over her shoulder, The weight of the tools a familiar, reassuring burden. The weight of the plumb bob was a secret anchor in her bag, a connection to the only truth she had left. For 3 days she traveled west, first on foot, then by a series of rattling freight wagons whose drivers she paid with small coins, saving the folded bills. The landscape changed from the soft, rolling green of her home to a harsher, drier country of scrub brush and ochre-colored rock. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of dust and distance. She was heading nowhere in particular, guided only by a vague instinct to put as much of this hard, unforgiving land as possible between herself and the memory of her uncle's cold eyes. She arrived in a town that seemed to be the last stop for everything. It was called Terminus, and it clung to the edge of a vast, empty expanse of desert canyon lands. The buildings were low and sun-bleached, their false fronts peeling like sunburned skin. Wind whispered down the single main street, carrying sand that gritted between her teeth. It was a place where people ended up, not where they began. In the town's general store, a cavernous room that smelled of coffee, leather, and dust, she bought a loaf of bread and a piece of cheese. As the proprietor, a stout woman with weary but watchful eyes, wrapped her purchase, Alara overheard 2 men leaning against the counter. They were dressed in the worn denim and stained felt hats of ranchers. "Heard the county finally sold the Dust Devil's Folly," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "About time," the other grunted. "Let some other fool break his back on that pile of rocks. Cursed, I tell you. Old man Kane went in there and never came out. Place has been empty 50 years. Who'd be dumb enough to buy it? Clerk said some drifter paid the back taxes. $3. Can you believe it? $3 for a hole in the ground." They both laughed, a harsh, crackling sound. Alara felt a flicker of something inside her. It was not hope, not yet. It was a resonance, the hum of a line pulled taut. A hole in the ground, a pile of rocks, cursed, $3. The numbers were an absurdity, a joke. But she had seen her grandfather build cellars and foundations, carving clean, strong spaces from the unyielding earth. He had taught her that a hole in the ground could be a sanctuary if it was shaped with knowledge and respect. She finished her transaction with the woman, who introduced herself as Mary. Mary's gaze lingered on Alara's calloused hands and the straightness of her back. It was a look of appraisal, not pity. "Where you headed, girl?" Mary asked, her voice softer than it had been with the ranchers. "Looking for a place to start," Alara said simply. "Not much to start with out here," Mary said, though her tone lacked the rancher's dismissiveness. "Just wind and rock." "I know rock," Alara replied. She found the county clerk's office in a small brick building next to the sheriff's station. The clerk was a thin, sallow man with ink stains on his fingers and a permanent air of weary condescension. When she asked about the property known as the Dust Devil's Folly, a smirk touched his lips. "You're too late, miss. Already sold it this morning," he said, enjoying the moment. Alara's heart sank, the flicker of interest extinguished. She turned to leave. "Wait a minute," the clerk said, squinting at her. "You ain't the one, are you? The one who sent the boy in with the money?" Alara paused. She understood in an instant. The rancher's story was from yesterday. The sale wasn't final. "The money was sent, but the deed was not signed," she said, her voice steady. "I am here to sign it." The clerk's smirk returned, wider this time. He clearly believed her to be a fool, but a fool with $3 was a customer. He pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf and opened it. He took out a deed, the paper yellowed and brittle. "It's a quitclaim deed. No guarantees, no survey. You get the land as is. Where is? Lot 17 of the old Jericho mining survey. About 5 acres of worthless scree and a dugout. Sign here." She read the document carefully. The legal language was dense, but the core of it was simple. The county was washing its hands of a piece of forgotten, useless land. She took the pen he offered and signed her name, Alara Vance. Then she opened her coin purse and counted out 3 silver dollars, their rims worn smooth with time. She pushed them across the scarred wooden counter. The clerk swept them into his drawer with a flick of his wrist. He stamped the deed with a heavy, final-sounding thud and slid it over to her. "Congratulations," he said, his voice thick with irony. "You're a landowner." He chuckled to himself as she folded the paper and placed it in her satchel. The walk to her property took 2 hours. Mary at the general store had given her directions, pointing toward a deep notch in the distant canyon wall. The path was little more than a goat track, winding upward through sagebrush and jagged rock. The sun beat down, and the air was still and hot. Finally, she rounded a towering buttress of red sandstone and saw it. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a neat hole, but a gaping, ragged mouth in the cliff face, half choked with a century of sand, rockfall, and desiccated brush. The timbers that had once framed the entrance were splintered and rotted, sagging inward like broken teeth. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The clerk's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. She had traded the last of her dignity for a tomb. She slid the satchel from her shoulder and sank onto a flat rock, the heat of it soaking through her thin trousers. For a long moment, she just stared, the sheer scale of the dereliction threatening to crush her. What had she done? This was not a foundation to be built upon. It was a wound in the earth. She felt the familiar burn behind her eyes, the one she had suppressed in her uncle's hallway. Here, alone with the silent, indifferent rock, it threatened to overwhelm her. Her hand, seeking some comfort, went into her satchel. Her fingers closed around the familiar shape of the plumb bob. She pulled it out, the brass warm from the ambient heat. It lay heavy in her palm, a small, solid piece of certainty in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Gravity doesn't lie. She stood up. The tears receded. Crying would not clear the rubble. Weeping would not square the frame. She slung the satchel back over her shoulder and walked toward the dark opening. She would not be a victim. She would be a builder. The air inside was thick and cool, smelling of deep earth, dry rot, and the faint, musky scent of animals that had used it for shelter. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that penetrated the gloom. The floor was a treacherous landscape of loose rock and soft sand. The dugout was larger than it appeared from the outside, extending deep into the cliff. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the marks of hand tools still visible. She moved cautiously, testing each footstep. Her first priority was shelter. She needed a safe place to sleep, a corner to defend against the vastness of the wilderness and her own encroaching doubt. In the back, she found a side chamber, a small alcove no bigger than a closet, that had been protected from the main rockfall. The ceiling was solid stone, and the floor was mostly clear. This would be her starting point, a fortress of one. She spent the rest of the day clearing the alcove, using her hands and a flat piece of shale as a makeshift spade. It was brutal, back-breaking work. By dusk, she had a small, clean space. She unrolled her bedroll, ate the last of her cheese, and sat in the profound darkness, listening to the whisper of the wind outside. It was a lonely sound, but it was the sound of her own place. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard labor. Each morning she would work on clearing the main chamber, one bucket of rock and sand at a time, hauling it out and dumping it down the slope. She worked until her muscles screamed and her hands were raw. In the process, she began to learn the space. It was not one room, but a series of interconnected chambers. The main room was a living area, with a crude stone hearth and chimney flue carved straight up through the rock. Another chamber seemed to be a workshop, with a collapsed stone bench. A third was a storage room, filled with the shattered remains of barrels and crates. It was on the 4th day, while clearing the hearth, that she found it. She was prying out the rubble that choked the firebox, her fingers tracing the lines of the stonework. Her grandfather had taught her to read stone like a book. He'd shown her how different types of rock weathered, how mortar aged, how a well-set course should feel beneath the hand. Most of the hearth was built from the same red sandstone as the cliff itself, but one stone, low down on the left side, was different. It was a piece of dark, dense basalt, its surface smoother and cooler to the touch. It didn't belong. Its edges were too perfect, the mortar line around it too thin, almost a hairline crack. It was set, but it was not bonded. It was a plug, not a brick. A thrill, sharp and electric, shot through her. This was an anomaly. This was a secret. She took a thin pry bar from her tool roll and carefully worked the tip into the faint line around the stone. It resisted at first. She didn't force it. She tapped it gently, working her way around the edges, loosening the dust and grit of decades. She felt a slight shift. She applied more pressure and the stone moved, grating softly. With a final heave, it came free, revealing a dark square cavity behind it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached into the cool darkness, her fingers brushing against something cold, hard, and metallic. It was a handle. She gripped it and pulled. With a groan of protest, a heavy iron box slid out into the light. It was a strong box, about 2 feet long and a foot wide, its surface pitted with rust, but its construction solid. A heavy, simple lock secured it. For a moment, she considered trying to smash it open, but that was not her way. That was a plunderer's way. Her grandfather had taught her that most locks were just puzzles. She fetched her chisels and a small hammer. She did not attack the lock itself, but the pins of the hinges. They were old and rusted. She used the smallest chisel as a drift, tapping with precise, controlled blows. The sound rang out in the quiet cavern. After 10 minutes of patient work, the first pin gave way. The second was more stubborn, but it too eventually yielded. She set her tools aside and carefully pried the lid open. The interior was lined with oilcloth, still supple, and resting inside, nestled in the dark fabric, was a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. The box was filled with gold coins. They were not neatly stacked, but lay in a glittering pile, winking in the dim light. She picked one up. It was heavy, heavier than any coin she had ever held. On one side was an eagle, on the other, the head of liberty. She recognized them from books. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces. There were hundreds of them, a fortune beyond comprehension. Beneath the coins, there was something else. She carefully lifted them out, stacking them in gleaming piles on the stone floor. At the bottom of the box lay a leather-bound journal, wrapped in another layer of oilcloth. A leather thong held it shut. Her hands trembled as she untied it and opened the cover. The first page was written in a surprisingly neat, elegant hand. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you have found my secret, and I am long gone to dust. My name is Silas Kane. The world knew me as a failed prospector, and then as a hermit, the dust devil who haunted this canyon. Both are lies I cultivated. I was not a failure. I was betrayed." Ilara sat back on her heels, the weight of the gold forgotten. She read on, engrossed in the story of a man who had lived in this very space a lifetime ago. Kane had come west with a partner, a man named Corbin. Together they had discovered a rich vein of quartz laced with gold, not far from this spot. It was the strike of a lifetime. But while Kane was in town filing the claim, Corbin, consumed by greed, ambushed him on the trail, beat him, and left him for dead, taking the maps and the preliminary assays. Corbin filed the claim in his own name, but Kane had not died. He had crawled back to this dugout, a place they had used as a temporary camp, and nursed himself back to health. He knew something Corbin did not. The map Corbin stole only showed the smaller, secondary veins. The mother lode, the heart of the strike, was accessible only from a hidden fissure deep inside this very cave system. "I let the world think me dead," Kane wrote. I became a ghost. I watched from this hole in the rock as Corbin's men tore the mountain apart for scraps, never finding the true source. They called the claim Corbin's Folly and eventually abandoned it. When they left, the mountain was mine again. I spent 30 years working the vein, by hand, by candlelight. I took only what I needed, turning the rock into the coins you see before you. I had no use for them. My life was already spent. My family back east believed me dead. To return would be to undo their peace. The journal chronicled his solitary life, the slow, patient work of mining, the quiet joy of shaping his home, his observations of the stars from the mouth of his cave, the changing of the seasons across the canyon. It was a record of profound loneliness, but also of a deep, abiding peace. He wrote of the rock as if it were a living thing, a friend. The final entry was dated 50 years prior. The handwriting was shaky. My time is short. This mountain has been my sanctuary and my tomb. I leave this cache not as a treasure to be plundered, but as a seed to be planted. I do not know who you are, finder, but I hope you have hands that know how to build, not just to take. I hope you see the beauty in this rock, as I did. This place gave me shelter when the world cast me out. May it do the same for you. Use this gold to make a life here. Make this hollow place a home. Defend it. Nurture it. Let it be a fortress of solitude, not a prison of loneliness. That is the only payment I ask. Live the life I could not. It is all yours. A blessing from one ghost to another. Tears, hot and sudden, fell onto Alara's dusty hands. They were not tears of grief or despair, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone. A stranger, a ghost from half a century ago, understood her. He had seen her coming. He had left her not just a fortune, but a purpose and a blessing. She was the builder he had hoped for. She carefully closed the journal and rewrapped it in its oilcloth shroud. She looked at the piles of gold, no longer just a treasure, but a tool. It was the means to fulfill the charge she had been given. She looked around the dark, debris-filled cavern. It was no longer a ruin. It was a promise. The next morning, Alara walked back to Terminus. She walked with a new purpose, her stride long and confident. She went directly to Mary's general store. Mary was sweeping the wooden porch, and she paused, leaning on her broom as Alara approached. "Back already?" Mary asked, her eyes taking in the change in Alara's demeanor. "Thought the mountain might have swallowed you up." "I need supplies," Alara said, and she pulled a list from her pocket. It was a long list: sacks of lime and sand for mortar, saws, hammers, nails of every size, heavy timbers for framing, tar for roofing, glass for a window, a cast-iron stove, food to last for months. Mary's eyebrows rose as she read the list. "This is a whole homestead, girl. This is more than a starting place." "That's the idea," Alara said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out one of Silas Kane's gold coins, laying it on the counter. Mary picked it up, her practical nature warring with her surprise. She bit it, a habit from a bygone era. Her eyes widened. "This is real," she whispered. She looked at Alara, 100 questions in her eyes, but she asked none of them. She saw the quiet determination, the lack of boastfulness. She simply nodded. "I'll have to send to the city for some of this. The timbers will have to be brought down from the high country. It'll take time. And a freight team." "I have time," Alara said, "and I can pay for the freight." Over the next few weeks, as the supplies trickled in, Alara began the real work. The work began not with building, but with unbuilding. She cleared the entire dugout, from the entrance to the deepest chamber. It was a monumental task. She built a ramp, and using a simple wheelbarrow she'd bought from Mary, she moved tons of rock and sand, creating a wide, flat terrace outside the entrance. She discovered the full extent of the dwelling: 5 rooms, connected by arched doorways Kane had painstakingly carved. When the first load of lumber arrived, she began the restoration in earnest. She started with the entrance. Using her adze and saws, she squared the crumbling opening, her cuts clean and precise. She built a heavy frame from 12 by 12 timbers, fitting them together with mortise and tenon joints her grandfather had taught her to cut. She used her plumb bob constantly, ensuring every post was true, vertical, every beam perfectly level. The heavy brass weight, hanging silent and steady from its line, was her guide and her partner. One afternoon, a man appeared at the edge of the terrace. He was broad-shouldered and soot-stained, with a magnificent beard and arms like tree trunks. He watched her for a long time as she hoisted a beam into place, using a simple block and tackle she had rigged. "That's an old adze," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. Alara turned. "It was my grandfather's." "He knew his tools," the man said, nodding toward the clean, scalloped marks she had left on the wood. "I'm Jedediah, the blacksmith down in Terminus." "Alara." He looked at her work, at the squared frame, the neat piles of sorted stone she intended to reuse. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "Mary said you were building something. She didn't say you were building it right." There was no higher compliment in his vocabulary. "Your saw looks like it could use a sharpening. And those chisels." "I'd be grateful," she said. "What do I owe you?" "We'll work it out," he said. It was not an offer of charity, but of trade, an acknowledgement of mutual competence. He respected the work. That was the coin of the realm in this hard country. Jedediah became a regular visitor. He would bring her sharpened tools and stay to watch her work, offering quiet advice on the local stone or the best way to temper a tool. He taught her how to build a small, efficient forge on her terrace, and showed her how to heat and bend the iron straps she needed for her door hinges. In return, she built him a set of perfectly balanced shelves for his chaotic workshop. A community of two was being forged, built on the ring of a hammer and the scent of hot iron. As the structure took shape, others came. An old trapper named Elias, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, appeared one day as silently as a shadow. He had known of Silas Kane, the Hermit. He told her stories of the man, filling in the gaps in the journal. He showed her where to find clean water in a hidden spring, and which plants were good for medicine. He approved of her work. "You're listening to the mountain," he said, his voice like rustling leaves. "Kane did that. The others, the ones with the big machines, they just shouted at it. It never shouts back. It just waits." Mary would sometimes make the long trip up from the store, bringing a freshly baked pie and news from the town. She saw the dugout transforming from a cave into a home. Alara, with painstaking labor, had chinked the interior walls with a lime mortar that brightened the space. She had laid a floor of smooth, flat stones, dug from a quarry Elias had shown her. She had installed the cast-iron stove, its pipe running up the chimney Kane had carved, and for the first time in 50 years, a warm, friendly curl of smoke rose from the Dust Devil's Folly. One day, the county clerk rode up on a tired-looking horse. He had clearly come out of a mixture of boredom and morbid curiosity, expecting to find her project abandoned, her supplies rotting, perhaps even her bones picked clean by coyotes. He dismounted and stared, his jaw slack. Before him was not a ruin, but a fortress. A heavy, beautifully crafted wooden door stood set in the massive timber frame. A single, multi-paned window, its glass glinting in the sun, was set into the rock next to it. The terrace was clean and orderly. The sound of a hammer ringing on steel came from the small forge where Alara was shaping a latch. She saw him, paused her work, and simply looked at him, her face calm, her hands steady. She did not smile. She did not need to. The clerk's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He muttered something under his breath, turned without a word, and rode away, his posture slumped in defeat. Jedediah, who had been helping her fit the latch, let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. The sound echoed across the canyon. The final touch was a name. She carved it herself into the heavy lintel above the door. She did not carve Dust Devil's Folly. She carved Cain's Rest. Winter arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. It came on the back of a wind that screamed down from the high peaks, carrying a blinding wall of snow. The old-timers called it a white hurricane. For 3 days, the world disappeared. The sky and the earth became one swirling vortex of white. Inside Cain's Rest, Alara was safe and warm. The stone walls held the heat from the iron stove, the deep earth insulating her from the storm's fury. She had stockpiled food, water, and firewood. The wind howled at her door, but it could not get in. Her work held. Silas Cain's work held. Her grandfather's lessons held. She sat by the fire, reading Cain's journal again, feeling a deep kinship with the solitary man who had weathered so many storms in this very spot. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. The snow was piled in immense drifts, 10 feet deep in places, burying the landscape in a blanket of profound silence. After a day of digging herself out, Alara saw a thin plume of smoke rising from the direction of Terminus, but it was the only one. Concern gnawed at her. She strapped on a pair of snowshoes Elias had helped her make and began the long, arduous trek into town. It took her 4 hours. What she found was a community on the brink. The snow had been heavier than anyone had seen in a generation. Several roofs had collapsed under the weight. The worst, however, was the general store. The main beam of the roof had cracked, and the whole structure was groaning, threatening to give way and bury the town's entire winter food supply under tons of snow and splintered timber. The men of the town stood around, helpless. Jedediah was there, his face grim. "We can't get on the roof to clear it," he said. "And if we try to brace it from inside, we might bring the whole thing down on our heads." Alara looked at the building, her eyes tracing the lines of stress, seeing it not as a store, but as a system of loads and supports. She saw the problem, and she saw the solution. It was a problem of leverage and distribution. "We don't need to push it up," she said, her voice cutting through the worried murmurs. "We need to hold it from below. We need to build a cradle." She sketched it out in the snow, a system of angled posts and cross braces that would distribute the load from the failing beam across the sturdy floor joists below. It was a technique her grandfather had used to support sinking floors in old seaside houses. The men looked at her, then at the drawing, then at Jedediah. The blacksmith, the most respected craftsman in town, stared at the sketch for a long moment. He looked at Alara, at her calm, confident face. He nodded, slowly at first, then with conviction. "The girl's right," he boomed. "It'll work. Get the timbers from my shop. Let's get to it." For the next 12 hours, Alara directed the work. She was no longer the strange girl from the mountain. She was the architect. Her voice was quiet but firm, her instructions precise. She showed them where to cut, where to place the posts, how to use wedges to slowly take the strain. She worked alongside them, her small frame belying her strength and stamina. Under her guidance, they built a fortress within the store, a skeleton of heavy timbers that caught the failing roof and held it fast. By nightfall, the store was secure. The town's food was safe. Mary, her face streaked with tears of relief, embraced Alara. "You saved us," she said simply. Her work wasn't done. A report came of a family of travelers whose wagon had been stranded in a drift a mile from town. Their fire had gone out. They were freezing. While the men organized a rescue party, Alara went back to Cain's Rest. She returned with blankets, high-energy food she had canned, and a special, slow-burning fuel brick Jedediah had helped her create for her forge. Her home, the Hermit's Cave, had become the town's emergency supply depot. Her act of service was complete. She had not just built a home for herself, she had become a cornerstone of the community. Spring came, and the world turned green again. The snow melted, feeding the hidden spring Elias had shown her. She used the water to tend a small garden on her terrace, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil. Cain's Rest was no longer just a dwelling. It was alive. The interior was finished, the stone walls clean and bright, the wooden furniture she had built simple and strong. Her grandfather's tools hung in a neat row on one wall of the workshop chamber, their steel gleaming. One quiet evening, as the setting sun painted the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and purple, Alara sat at the table she had built from a single slab of juniper. The air smelled of pine resin and blooming desert sage. She took out the brass plumb bob, its surface now holding a deep, soft luster from her frequent handling. She set it on the table. Next to it, she placed a small object she had found while finishing the last room. A single, perfect quartz crystal, clear as water, with a fleck of pure gold trapped inside it like a captured star. It was a stone Silas Cain had missed, or perhaps had left behind on purpose. The two objects sat side by side, the plumb bob, her grandfather's legacy of truth, skill, and unflinching integrity. The crystal, Silas Cain's legacy of endurance, solitude, and quiet rebellion. Her two inheritances, one of spirit and one of substance, had merged. They had built this life. She was no longer Alara Vance, the outcast. She was Alara of Cain's Rest, the woman who listened to the mountain. She had a home, a community built on the bedrock of mutual respect, and a profound, quiet peace that settled deep in her bones. She had learned the truth her grandfather had tried to teach her, that real inheritance wasn't land or money passed down, but the skill in your hands, the knowledge in your head, and the resilience in your spirit. She looked out from her doorway at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape that she now called home. The mocking words of the clerk echoed from a distant past, stripped of their power. He had sold her a hole in the ground for $3. He could never know, could never understand, that with those 3 coins, and the fortune of a ghost, and the lessons of a saint, she had purchased the entire world. It was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.